talks like this. So if you know anyone who's interested in going to law school in the DC area, or if you've been thinking about doing a visiting semester in the DC area school, not everyone knows because we're in Virginia, people don't realize that we're right across the river, so you feel free to take some of that.
He's trying to poach my students right now.
Thank you. I thought I was doing very subtly. And visiting students, it's okay to be a visiting student. And all of that. Got some DC experience. Anyway, there's a risk, of course, that when you write a book called Lawless about the Obama administration, that it'll be seen as not just partisan, but purely partisan. So I think there's at least one way of remedying that in part, which is, let me start with this. How many of you, if you're willing to, don't be shy, no one's recording you, they're recording me. How many of you voted for Barack Obama in 2012, or would have if you weren't in college and forgot to get your absentee ballot?
I don't want to
know. Maybe a third of you at least. And of those, how many of you are eager to see Donald Trump be president?
I'm guessing not many.
Not many. So, to the extent you're thinking, oh, it's all against Obama, I mean, really important aspect of all this is that anything the president does that is a potential abuse or expansion beyond the Constitution of his powers, of course, will be relied upon by the next president and future presidents to do similar, albeit potentially ideological and opposite things. So if you're thinking, oh, I like Obama, I don't want to hear about this, this is unfair, just think if Donald Trump was doing similar things to what Donald Trump wants to do, and then maybe we can see the broader implications of this. Let me talk about first an overview of the problem, and then run through briefly some of the highlights or lowlights of the Obama administration with regard to the rule of law, and then delve more specifically into a few examples. I'll spend, in particular, some time discussing the intellectual influences on the progressive left that have unfortunately made it more difficult to have an internal critique from within the Obama administration and its allies of some of the things that the administration has done that go beyond the president's legitimate power. So let's start with the problem. Obviously, it's nothing new for presidents to try to stretch the scope of their powers, and indeed, the modern trend of having more and more power in the executive branch goes back at least to President Theodore Roosevelt. As presidential power has grown since that time, since the progressive era, so has the abuse of presidential power. And while lots of things differentiate Republican and Democratic presidents over the last 100 years, one thing that they have in common is that they've all tried to aggressively expand their prerogatives at the expense of the other branches and the rule of law itself. Josh told me he's teaching Youngstown right after this. So Youngstown, if you remember, was the steel seizure case. For those of you who've read it for today or read it before, so here's a president seizing privately owned steel mills. So again, it's nothing new. Now, there was a reaction at some point by Congress in the 1970s after Watergate and Vietnam. So one Democratic president going to war in Vietnam without really going through normal war-making processes and sort of getting us involved in this war that turned out to be kind of a disaster. And then Watergate, all the corruption scandals, Robert G. Nixon, Congress put down and said, okay, we're going to try to restore power to Congress. And unfortunately, those reforms that were passed in the mid-70s really have been ineffectual. And it does seem that our presidents have, even if they haven't always acted lawfully, have at least generally felt constrained to pretend they're acting lawfully or stay within the limits of law. And the problem is that we may have started to reach a tipping point. We certainly had the Bush administration in the last decade arguing that we're not constrained by any kind of law with regard to executive power because the Constitution somehow has a clause that I've never actually noticed saying the president can do whatever he wants in foreign affairs and can't be interfered with. And now with the Obama administration, we have an administration that's been particularly aggressive about asserting presidential power and doing so in an unusually wide range of policy areas. In the past, when presidents have tried to assert dramatic increases in their own power, it's usually been in response to a crisis. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Korean War with Truman, the War on Terror with George Bush. We haven't really had any real crises. There's always minor crises going on in the world, but nothing like those going on in since the Obama came to office, yet we've still had the expansion of power. And indeed, President Obama has it's come to the point where not only does the president not do things surreptitiously or underhandedly to try to pretend he's obeying the rule of law, but not that he brags about it. He says, we can't wait, Josh, I got this from Josh, credit to the Josh, he
gave me a footnote in his books, I appreciate that.
That the president issued a series of statements where he said, we can't wait for Congress to act to do this, we can't wait for Congress to act to do that. In fact, the president himself started calling it my we can't wait statement, so it wasn't like he wasn't aware he was doing this. And the funny, if you look at the Constitution, there's no clause that says that if Congress refuses to go along with what the president wants, that the president therefore can't wait and then gets to do what the president wants. So it's problematic from a separation of powers point of view. So let me get to some more specifics. What abuses of executive power am I talking about? Well, that's what the whole book is really about. But to give you some examples very briefly, going to war in Libya and staying at war in Libya without either A, asking Congress for consent, or B, adhering to the War Powers Resolution, which requires that when you're engaged in military hostilities, you have to withdraw soldiers within 90 days unless Congress expresses its consent. Appointing so-called czars to high-level positions, and these aren't just advisors, these are people who have real policy-making roles with real authority, and they're supposed to be confirmed by the Senate and then subject to oversight hearings, but the president just says, oh, they're really just advisors when they're not, so we don't have to go through all of that. Modifying, delaying, and changing various parts of Obamacare without going through a notice and comment period, without going to Congress, without any legal pretense. Again, I borrowed a bunch of stuff from Josh in the book with footnotes, and one of them was what Josh calls government by blog post. There were actually major changes to Obamacare announced, not again through lawmaking process, not through the regulatory process, but literally through a blog post on HHS's, Health and Human Services website on a Friday afternoon when they knew no one's paying attention because all the media's gone home. We have attacking and slandering private citizens for engaging in constitutionally protected speech. I'm referring in particular to the Koch brothers, which whatever you think of them, it's not appropriate for the president to lie explicitly about what private citizens are doing. So you'd say, oh, you have this group of citizens for a sound economy. For all we know, they're foreigners who are buying up American politics. He knew they weren't foreigners, and he did anyway. And that really puts a chilling effect on First Amendment rights. Issuing draconian regulations regarding sexual assault on campus without, again, going through any normal lawmaking process or allowing it to be subject to review. Ignoring 100 years of advice from the Office of Legal Counsel and saying that the D.C. delegate could be a voting representative of the House of Representatives. Imposing Common Core standards on all the states by administrative fiat and more. Those are just some of them. Let me talk more specifically about three of those. First, let's talk about this D.C. delegate thing. You say, who really cares, other than people who live in D.C. perhaps, whether the D.C. delegate gets a vote? Well, that's just the point. Who really cares? And yet, what happened was, very early in the Obama administration, March of 2009, there was a bill proposed to give the D.C. delegate, who's currently Eleanor Holmes Norton, she's a long-serving delegate, a vote in the House of Representatives. The problem with this is that the Constitution says that only representatives of the states can have a vote in the House, and D.C. is not a state.
This was a King v. Burwell preview, by the way.
100 years of Office of Legal Counsel precedent, as I mentioned, said that we don't think that the D.C. delegate can be given a vote. And Obama's own Office of Legal Counsel, mostly appointed by Obama himself, said that you can't have this. And the Office of Legal Counsel, you have to remember, it is mostly, it's some career staff, mostly political appointees. Because they're mostly political appointees and they're in the executive branch, they bend over backwards to try to tell the president, yes, you can do this, we found authority. So if they say no, presidents have usually respected that because they understand this is one of the few, they're surrounded by sycophants and political operators, people like Rahm Emanuel, no offense to Rahm Emanuel, but maybe a yes offense, but these kind of people, they're about politics, they're not about the Constitution, the rule of law. The OLC at least has that as its job. Nevertheless, Eric Holder said, well, I don't care what the OLC says. I'm going to go to the Office of Solicitor General. I'm not going to ask the Office of Solicitor General whether this is constitutional or not. I'm going to ask them, is it so clearly, blatantly unconstitutional that there's absolutely no way you can defend this in court with a straight face? And under that standard, the SG's office said, okay, we would defend it if somehow this passed. We're not saying it's constitutional, though, of course. So that was really important because this is March 2009, 2 years before Obama got into office. You can't claim that the Republicans are being obstructionists. The president has to act. Obama has a huge majority in the House, a huge majority in the Senate, and yet Eric Holder and by extension the president proved themselves willing to undermine the Office of Legal Counsel so early in the administration, not over some major issue like going to war with somebody or passing Obamacare, but over nothing. Over whether the DC delegate got to vote, and if the DC delegate had gotten the vote, it would almost never break a tie, and if it never broke a tie, the court would overturn it anyway. So undermining one of the few independent legal voices in the administration over very little. Which brings us to the American bombing campaign in Libya. So, first of all, President Obama had promised as a candidate that unless there was an emergency, his view of the Constitution was you had to go to Congress first before he could bomb anybody. It's in the Boston Globe, December 2007, if you want to look it up. All right, that aside, then once you send forces into hostilities, again, the War Powers Resolution or Act, it's called both those things, dictates that you have to notify Congress, and then you have 90 days to withdraw soldiers. The Office of Legal Counsel told President Obama, you're bombing Libya, that's clearly hostilities, you have to tell Congress. Obama didn't like that answer. He went to the Defense Department. Defense Department lawyers say, you're bombing Libya, clearly hostilities, you have to go to Congress. So the President didn't like that answer. So we finally found a guy named Harold Koh, who was a former dean of Yale Law School, who was the State Department legal advisor, said, oh, I disagree, this isn't hostilities because we're bombing them from the air, and therefore the soldiers aren't at immediate risk, even though there's anti-aircraft missiles being shot at them, and therefore it's not really hostilities. Now the great irony of this is that if you're anything about Harold Koh, and there's no reason you would, Harold Koh built his entire academic career on arguing that the president needs to be more deferential to Congress in matters like bombing countries. And in fact, he had written in the 80s, after Libya was bombed once, not over months like Obama did, but once by President Reagan, that Congress should have asserted itself under the War Powers Resolution. So no one takes this legal analysis with a straight face, except for Akhil Amar, Yale Law School, who defended it. But every other law professor I've read or spoken to says, yeah, this was a completely ridiculous argument, that somehow it's not hostilities if you're bombing from the air and not from and aren't sending ground forces in. And indeed, one of the reasons the War Powers Act was passed to begin with was because President Nixon had been bombing Cambodia from the air, of course, without congressional approval, and it led to hundreds of thousands of deaths and didn't accomplish much except lead the way for the Khmer Rouge to eventually take power. So that wasn't considered a great foreign policy triumph. Finally, we have the Dear Colleague letter that was sent by the Department of Education, approved by the Justice Department, to every college and university in the country that takes federal funds. The federal funds defined as including any college that allows its students to use student loan money from the government to attend. So it's every college in the United States, it's 3, I believe now, is the total. And they said, from now on, when it comes to sexual assault on campus, here are the procedures you have to follow when you're investigating someone's claim, and here's the procedures you have to follow for any kind of tribunal you use. You can look up the letter yourself, it's on the internet. There is no legal authority cited for imposing these standards on universities, except that Title IX exists. Title IX, famous for prohibiting sex discrimination in sports, also prohibits the sex discrimination more generally in institutions of higher education that get federal funds. But there's nothing in Title VI that addresses sexual assault specifically, much less, you could argue it's sexual harassment, therefore sex discrimination, but certainly nothing that dictates you have to follow these exact standards. And the administration didn't cite any. It didn't go through notice and comment, didn't publish anything in the Federal Register. Because it was just a letter and not a formal regulation, it can't be appealed. So they asserted the authority to every university, you have to pass these things, you have to do these things without any legal authority. And worse yet, the standards that they promulgated take away the rights of students accused of sexual assault offenses to due process. Most famously, it forced all universities to use a preponderance of the evidence standard instead of clear and convincing. I don't find that in particular to necessarily deprive people of due process. But as an evidence professor, what really struck me was they really discouraged universities from allowing cross-examination, which is problematic, especially in the he said, she said situation. But much worse is that the guidelines absolutely forbid universities from allowing accused students to bring in any evidence of prior examples of sexual history of the complainant, of the woman or man who complains of sexual assault, unless they were with the accused. Why is that such a problem? Imagine this scenario. A woman is videotaped engaging in what someone considers to be a humiliating or degrading sexual act. The video then circulates on campus. Being humiliated, she then files a claim of sexual assault with the university saying this was not voluntary, this was not consensual. And she adds, I would never engage in this particular sexual act, it's disgusting. So the accused asks around, or maybe his lawyer asks around, and finds that there are 5 other men on campus who will swear under oath that they engaged in the exact same sexual act with this particular woman. And 2 of them have it on videotape. There is not a court in the United States, no matter how liberal, no matter how strong a rape shield law they have, no matter how concerned as we should be about not putting the victim on trial, who would say anything but that evidence has to be admitted, because how can you defend yourself properly from this claim without allowing this evidence to come in? You're not allowed to bring that evidence in under this guidance issued by the Department of Education. And remember, again, hasn't gone through any notice and comment, hasn't gone through any formal process. It's just a letter that a bureaucrat decided to write in the Obama administration. So those are, we can go on and on. Again, you can read the book if you want all the gory details. But one question is, I think a lot of us, and by a lot of us, I mean a lot of those of us who are law professors, lawyers, and so forth, who, even if we didn't like Obama in particular, in 2008, we thought that, well, look, he was a former lecturer in law, basically had non-tenure track but professor status at University of Chicago. He taught constitutional law there for many years. He seemed to come from this tradition of legal liberalism, which was the prevalent tradition from, say, the 1940s through the 1980s, that really was concerned with the rule of law, procedure, separation of powers, fair procedures. And what happened? What happened to the person we thought was going to be, as Jeff Rosen said in the Republic at the time, our first civil libertarian president, someone who Rosen was afraid would be so concerned about legal niceties that he wouldn't be able to act when he had to. And I think we misjudged whether Obama really came out of this tradition, and we probably misjudged how influential a different legal tradition has become on the legal left, which is a tradition that is skeptical of traditional notions of the rule of law and skeptical of constitutional fidelity. On the constitutional fidelity front, there's been, since the rise of originalism, mostly on the right since the 1980s, there's been this counter movement on the left to say, oh, actually the Constitution has no objective meaning. Right? It's all about the living Constitution, the breathing Constitution, it hasn't changed with time. Well, I mean, that doesn't mean you don't have any sense of constitutional fidelity, but at some point, if you denigrate the objective meaning of the Constitution, it makes it much harder when you really want to do something to think the Constitution stands in your way. Well, should the Constitution yield to the felt necessities of the time? On the issue of the rule of law, there was a movement in the 1920s called legal realism, which some of you may have heard about, which came to dominate in many ways your legal education. Because not only did some left-wing movements arise out of it, law and economics and the law and society movement, which is a sort of sociology sort of based movement, also arose out of it. And they said, look, the old-fashioned kind of legal education was you just read a bunch of cases, figured out what the rules of law are from those cases, and that's the law. And that's inadequate as a practical matter in a time when statutes and not common law predominate. But more important, it misunderstands what law is. Law is not these abstract principles. Law has to be a product of society itself. And more importantly, the idea that judges or other legal interpreters are somehow neutral is a bunch of nonsense. Famously, one legal realist said, it all depends on what the judge had for breakfast. And that's a really crude version of legal realism, and it's stupid. Anyone who's ever clerked for a judge will tell you, yes, there are rules that judges have to apply, and that the vast majority of cases, even on the federal courts, where you have Democrats or Republicans appointed by presidents of very different ideologies, 90% of the time they just issue unanimous opinions, because everyone knows what the rule of law is. Nevertheless, it's true that other factors other than pure legal analysis affect judges. their ideology, their maybe, Sotomayor famously said, a wise Latina could add some information, maybe your ethnic background, maybe how wealthy you are, or how poor you are, your class background. There are also things that might potentially influence you. That's great. The problem was that a lot of this stuff came out of the German sociological movement of the 1870s and 1880s. A lot of our most famous jurists studied in Germany. And what happened with Germany? Well, we know what happened with Germany. And people thought, in the 1930s and 40s, maybe we should think more about the rule of law.
30 minutes for Godwin's law to kick in.
Sorry?
30 minutes for Godwin's law to kick in.
It's not that there were Nazis, it's actually that they say, well, if we go too far down the road towards legal realism and stop believing in underlying legal principles in the rule of law, we risk Nazi Germany or fascist Italy or Stalin's Russia. When you don't have the rule of law, you want the totalitarianism. And that became the foundation for legal liberalism in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that we want to have progressive economics and so forth, but we also want to make sure we're adhering to the rule of law. Then in the 1970s, though, a more radical left-wing movement, which you've probably heard of, called critical legal studies came around. We call them the crits. And the crits said, let's go back to the legal realists. It turns out that all this stuff about rule of law and whatnot, it's all about politics and power. Law is politics, is the famous mantra. That there's really no distinction between law and politics. We just dress up people in black robes and give them titles, call them Your Honor, and that's just a way for the ruling class to impose its will on the people by pretending there's some independent value to the rule of law, when in reality they're just engaging in class and ideological-based interests. That was followed by the late 1980s, and this was all sort of peaked right when Barack Obama and I were in law school at the same time we were in law school, with the growth of the critical race theory movement, which said that it's not about class interests, it's about the white power structure preserving self-empower, that's what law is, and feminists were saying it's all about the patriarchy, but they all basically come down to the mantra that law is politics. There's no independent value to the rule of law as such. In fact, the rule of law, the whole concept of the rule of law, again, is just a construct meant to fool people into thinking there's such a thing as objectivity. Now, the crits, like I said, peaked in the late 1980s. And while they still have a fair amount of influence in law schools, they've never been a majority, even among the majority of law professors who are liberals. But that doesn't mean they haven't had any influence. For example, if you read the mission statement of the American Constitution Society, which is the liberal analog to the Federalist Society, they say we are interested in the rule of law, along with genuine equality and a whole bunch of other stuff. Right, here are our goals. We have the rule of law, we like genuine equality. I have this in my notes somewhere, but that quote now I can't find it. But be that as it may, the point is that whereas a prior generation of legal liberals would have said our priority is the rule of law. Without the rule of law, we have anarchy and chaos and discrimination, and it's narcissistic and nihilistic, and maybe we'll wind up with totalitarianism. Even among the mainstream liberal left, there's a view that the rule of law is not all it's cracked up to be. So, this again does not mean that the crits controlling the Obama administration, I think, is all mainstream liberals, but it does mean that this rule of law tradition has been somewhat denigrated in favor of a tradition that says, if there's a conflict between rule of law principles and things that we really think are important, like genuine equality or social justice, that it's not that rule of law inherently wins. We have to kind of balance them. And the way the Obama administration, seems to me, has approached rule of law issues, which is not unique to it, but I think it's more prevalent and pervasive than it has been before, is to say, here's what the president wants to do. Let's figure out if there's some statute, constitutional argument, something that would let the president do that, that's not completely ridiculous. That, again, like as with the DC delegate case, that we could defend in court with a straight face. Now, the rule of law perspective would be, let's first figure out what the law is. How does the law constrain the president? And within those constraints, what can we do? But especially in domestic affairs. Oddly enough, President Obama has been, I think there's a new book by Charlie Savage of the New York Times. I think he persuaded me that, interestingly, oddly enough, in complete opposite contrast to the Bush administration, that they were more concerned with the rule of law with regard to international affairs. They like international law. They're internationalists. I think international law is really important. Separation of powers, the Constitution, less important. So domestic affairs, their view really has been, let's figure out what we want to do. Let's then go to OLC and say, is there some theory you can come up with that will allow us to do it? So that doesn't put unlimited authority in the president, in the sense that, yes, you can stretch the law only so far before it breaks, and there are certain things the Obama administration has not done. They would like to have used the immigration guidance that the president issued to de facto legalize even more people, and OLC said, well, look, you can't do that. This is how far he can reasonably go. He might still lose if you get challenged in court, as they have so far, but at least we can make an argument with a straight face. But when you have a situation where we're trying to say basically, can our lawyers think of a way we can defend this once we decide what we want to do, rather than what can we do, and then we'll figure out within those constraints what we want to do, you really have the rule of clever lawyers rather than the rule of law. And again, you could say, well, other presidents have done similar things. How much different is it? And the strange thing, though, about the Obama administration, the thing that does make it somewhat unique, is that the president, again, doesn't deny that. He says, Congress doesn't act. I'm going to get my veto. I'm going to get out my executive order pen and paper and sign things and ignore Congress. One thing that really struck me was researching and writing my book, which I will wave again for you, since I'm proud of it, is that the president had, that in the past, we had people in Congress, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia is a good example, who were in the old guard, who believed in the separation of powers and says they want to preserve the institutions of power. They want to preserve the Senate's authority vis-a-vis the president. You had also Russ Feingold of Wisconsin was into this, and Russ Feingold. Where's Feingold from?
Wisconsin.
That is Wisconsin. Herbert Kohl also Wisconsin.
Yep.
Yeah, that's why I was getting confused. Both from Wisconsin. Say about Wisconsin led Democrats to really want to preserve the authority of the Senate. Anyway, so you have people who did that. And that's what the framers of the Constitution counted on. They counted on the fact that even if people tend to agree with the president in the Senate or House, they want to preserve their own power. That each branch would check the other branch. And one thing that's happened, this is not Obama's fault, and this is not particularly a result of any progressive ideology, but has been a trend for a while, is that we've become a more partisan and a more divided country. We used to have liberal Republicans, conservative Democrats, or I still remember when Ronald Reagan ran for president. I'm old enough to barely remember that. He won New York. He won California, right? We can't imagine a Republican winning these states nowadays. These states were up for grabs, and the South was up for grabs. It wasn't all Republican. Jimmy Carter won most of the states in the South in 1976. He won several of them even in 1980. But now it's all divided. So now we've come to a point where almost no one in either house of Congress wants to defend its own prerogatives. They do whatever is in the interest of the president of their own party. So when Bush was doing things that people thought were abusing the Constitution, you had all Democrats attacking him, you had very few Republicans criticizing him. John McCain was one of the few. For the most part, the Republicans fell in line, didn't hold hearings, didn't do anything. Now when President Obama is in power, he not only does things that a lot of people think are abusing his authority, but he actually says to Congress, at the 2013 State of the Union, he says, Congress doesn't want to enact my agenda, so I'm going to do as much of it as I can on my own. So you think, if the self-interested Democrats would say, well, that's taking away our power. Let's boo that, or at least let's make it clear that we don't like it. Instead, they all stood up and gave him a standing ovation. So that's yet another problem. Now, the question I often get is, well, why don't the courts step in? And the answer is that courts have been traditionally reluctant to get involved in disputes between the executive and Congress, on the theory that, well, Congress has power of the purse, and Congress other ways they can fight it out. They can fight it out politically, and each house will go against the other. And it turns out, like I said, this isn't really working out. President Obama, when he was confronted with allegations in 2014, my book came out about a year too late, because when I started writing it, no one was talking about this stuff. All of a sudden, everyone was. And people asked President Obama about it at his press conference in July 2014. He said, well, so sue me. I'm not going to defend myself. If you think I'm doing things unconstitutional, bring it to court. And yet, every time people sue him, his lawyers go to court and say they don't have any standing to sue, because the courts have been reluctant to hear these things. So this is really a big deal now that the Supreme Court has decided to hear the challenge to President Obama's immigration guidance. Not only do they say we're going to hear it, but we're going to decide whether he's violating his duty to take care of the Constitution. It seems to me a stunning development, and it shows that the courts, at least some justices on the Supreme Court, think it's important to start getting involved with this because it's getting out of hand the way the branches are at loggerheads, but there doesn't seem to be any resolution. In any event, Obama and his allies would no doubt pose this dilemma this way. So what I want to tell you in saying this is I don't think they're bad people. They're thinking things like, well, look, let's talk about Obamacare. Maybe the most outrageous thing the president has done is this government by blog post, from a purely legal point of view. Right? From a political point of view, though, President Obama will say, well, look, we passed this law giving millions of people access to health insurance. The Republicans refused to vote for it, and once it became law anyway, they've done everything they can to undermine it, and we've had some glitches that have come up, and they refuse to talk about anything except repeal. So what am I supposed to do? Just let the law sink into oblivion and have millions of people lose health insurance with no obvious replacement, or tinker with it a little bit outside the normal legal process? The problem with this is that we have to look beyond the current debates, the current issues of Obamacare or anything else. And think again, well, what would President Trump do with that kind of theory? Right? Whatever happens to President Trump, it's unlikely that he'll always have a majority. I mean, God forbid, but President Trump will have a majority if he ever became president on everything he does.
Ted Cruz wrote the forward for his book, just in case you're curious.
Some of you may be even less eager to have Ted Cruz be president than Donald Trump. Just imagine what they could do. And in fact, I think smart liberals, there have been some smart liberals who criticize Obama on this, are worried. They say, well, if Obama could tinker with Obamacare, what could President Cruz do to the tax system? Let's say he tries to repeal the capital gains tax, and then Congress won't go along. Could he just say, from now on, I'm just directing the IRS. IRS has a lot of enforcement responsibilities, and you can't catch every tax cheat. So anyone who's not paid capital gains tax, we're just not going to enforce the laws against them. In general, liberals like bigger government, with some exceptions, and conservatives like small government, with some exceptions. So it's a lot easier for a president to refuse to enforce stuff than to enforce new stuff that's not in the law. Right? Courts are much more likely, if you try to say, well, there's no tax law saying you have to pay this much, but they'll make you do it anyway, courts are going to strike that down. But if President Cruz refuses to enforce the tax laws, it's not clear we have standing to make it. So if you want to preserve your tax laws, your environmental regulations, your healthcare regulations, your health and safety regulations, you should be upset at the prospect. You should not only be upset at the prospect that the president won't be enforcing the rules as strictly as they're written, but you should be upset at the precedent that's being set now that President Obama is doing so without even really giving the legal rationale for what he's doing, because this could be really dangerous in the other hands. So I think ultimately that President Obama's actions that I've described are not simply wrong-headed, they're actually very dangerous. And they're not dangerous because I don't like President Obama. Some of his most controversial things are things I'm either somewhat indifferent to, like Common Core, or actually agree with, like his immigration policies. So it's not that I necessarily don't want any of these policies. I just think that it is important. I do adhere to a traditional view of the rule of law. In the American political and constitutional system, the separation of powers is a key element of the rule of law. If we want to preserve the rule of law, therefore, we need to ensure that some of the abuses that have been going on don't continue, and that people of all political ideologies speak out in favor of preserving our constitutional system, so that regardless of who's president, the rule of law is achieved. Thank you very much.
Now I get to talk. So, everyone hear me okay? Sit down. So it's actually an honor. As I said, David was my college professor. I sat in his class in 2007.
Should have studied more.
Should have studied more. But I see so many shades of myself when I hear David talking that it makes me feel all warm and fuzzy. So one point I want to bridge off on to David is about our partisanship. Now, if you notice, I close my eyes when you raise your hand. I don't want to know what your policy is. I don't care. But I do want to discuss some trends. So every year, people are surveyed on two questions. One, would you be okay with your son or daughter marrying some of the opposite race? The question is interracial marriage. Another question is, would you be okay with your son or daughter marrying some of the opposite party, right? That is, if you're a Republican, do you want your daughter marrying a Democrat? And if you're a Democrat, would you want your son marrying a Republican? Okay? So in the 1950s and 60s, as we imagine, a lot of people were opposed to interracial marriage. Believe it or not, in 1958, 4% of Americans support interracial marriage. 1968, 20% supported it. 1983, 43% supported it. Today, it's over 90%, basically a done deal, right? What about party? So in 1960, only 5% of Americans would have a problem with their child marrying some of the opposite political party. Only 5%. Today, it's over 50%. Think about that for a second, right? We've come so far on racial discrimination, right? That people are basically, okay, whatever, my son marries some of the opposite race, no big deal. We've reverted on political discrimination. In fact, Cass Sunstein at Harvard has called this partyism. It's a new ism, right? That's a discrimination. And I think this massive discrimination against party has bled into the body of politics. So much so that, as David eloquently put, we have people who oppose something merely because the opposite party said this. You know, Republicans said, we are not going to support Obama because it's Obama. And Democrats said, we're not going to support Bush because he's Bush. And I promise you, the second we have a Republican president, all these slumbering law professors will wake up and go, oh, yawn, man, that was a nice 7-year nap. Look at all these rule of law violations Trump's doing. You're going to see with Cruz's eligibility. The professors have been quiet, saying, wait, is Cruz eligible? Wait, we have to take Texas history seriously. I'm very skeptical. These people have been quiet for 7 years. Suddenly say, wait, that guy born in Canada, this can't be right. Anyway. So the point I'd like to convey is that we have massive gridlock in our system. And it's often said that gridlock is a bad thing. And I want to push back against it. So if those of you who did the reading for today in Youngstown, which we'll have in about 30 minutes, you may have noticed there's a quote from Justice Brandeis' dissent in Myers, which we'll read later, where he said that this friction is actually part of the system. We do not have a democracy. We have a republic. And when people don't agree, stuff does not happen. We need the House, we need the Senate, you need the executive, and you need the courts all to agree before something goes forward. If any of those parties are lacking, you can't get much done. So it really isn't surprising that in such a polarized society, people don't agree, you don't pass laws. This is not surprising in the least at all. What frustrates that is when the executive says, you know what, we have these checks and balances, I'm not getting the laws I want, I'm going to do it anyway. We can't wait, right? We can't wait. I have my pen, I have my phone, I don't want to wait for Congress, and oh, by the way, my last year of the presidency, I'm going to do as much as I can by executive action before I leave office, right? Like the midnight appointments of John Adams, except these are the midnight executive orders. And I think that's extremely problematic because it frustrates separation of powers. Yeah, maybe we should have a parliamentary system. In England, it's really easy to pass laws. The prime minister becomes unpopular, they toss him out with a referendum. We don't have that. So I think in many respects, the current mode is inconsistent with our constitutional design. I think it's become justified in light of this gridlock. I think the lesson we have to learn is the only way to eliminate gridlock is not with more executive action. When you take executive action, it pisses people off more and they're less likely to cooperate, right? When you tell, let's say, the union, Congress, if you don't work with me, I'll do it myself, what incentive do they have to pass any legislation? You're just going to ignore it anyway. So the way to actually eliminate gridlock is actually to unite people. And the executive action that's been taken in recent years has done just the exact opposite. It's frustrated us. It's divided us. And I think that will be the most enduring legacy, that as it stands today, people just don't like those of the opposite party. They don't agree with them. They think they're out to get them. Perhaps one of the reasons why Donald Trump has been so successful is he doesn't have an ideology. He's an authoritarian, among other things, right? But he's not a strict ideologue in the traditional Republican Democratic sense. And I think people of all parties have gravitated to him. I saw a poll saying 20% of Democrats would actually vote for him. That must have Hillary Clinton scared out of her wits. So I think in the next presidency, I'm not quite sure who will be in charge. But I'm sure we'll see more of the same. I'm sure the people who are quiet now will become very rancorous. The people who are rancorous now will become quiet. And this will go on for the foreseeable future. David and I, we're going to keep complaining until we're blue in the face.
I have contempt for both parties, so that makes me a more neutral observer, hopefully.
Yes, but we'll keep complaining. And I'm going to stop here because I want to hear what questions all of you have. So thank you all so much. I'm grateful for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Do you have any questions from the audience? Scott.
Kind of got one here. President Obama has recently signed some executive orders on gun control and his agenda on that front. What's the best way to get rid of those executive orders on gun control? How do we fight back?
Did everyone hear the question real fast?
No.
Can y'all rephrase it?
He wants to know how we get rid of the president's recent executive orders on gun control. That's actually assuming you want to, which I'm sure not everyone here agrees with, that's very easy. You just sort of elect the president against it, because that's one of the things about executive orders. Besides the separation of powers, rule of law kinds of issues, they're not laws. They're officially just the president's interpretation of the law that he's telling his underlings to obey. And if you get a new president, they can sign a new executive order saying that either repealing the old one or actually saying the opposite. So unlike a real law, which is passed through Congress and the president can only be repealed through actions of Congress and the president, the executive orders are only temporary. One problem with the president's executive orders is immigration. What do you do if you're an undocumented person in the United States who is trying to decide whether to take advantage of it? Do you take advantage of it and therefore at least indefinitely get to stay legally, get a work permit? Or do you say to yourself, well, if I now reveal myself to the government, give them all the information they want, that'll make it that much easier for President Trump to deport me once he repeals the executive order?
So let me build up on David. We'll be talking about the immigration case in class in about 2 weeks. But the short order is, regardless of what the Supreme Court does with immigration, the next election will decide it. Let me explain what I'm saying. If Hillary Clinton wins, she will continue the president's policies no matter what the Supreme Court does. She'll find another way to accomplish it. If a Republican president wins, whoever it is, they'll stop it. So if this is upheld by the Supreme Court in July of 2016, and you're an undocumented immigrant, are you really going to sign up with 3 months left in the presidency and roll the dice? This has to be done in the next administration. The president can't do this as a practical matter. Legal matter, I think it's awfully unconstitutional, as we'll discuss in class. But practically, the next election will decide the fate of this case. Is there a
On the question of Cruz's natural citizenship, I saw the lawsuit filed obviously in the last couple of days.
It's a joke.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of standing, I mean can you separate that from a purely political question?
I think there are, I forget who it was, someone I think at the Balkanization blog wrote, I think it was Sandy Levinson at the University of Texas, wrote, here are 9 ways, or he just wrote it in the Commonwealth professors mailing list that we're on. Here are 9 ways where someone could possibly get standing. I can imagine someone getting standing, and maybe it's better sooner rather than later. Because imagine, for example, that the Secretary of State of Virginia decides, and that's a deciding state, decides that I don't think Ted Cruz is eligible to be president, so I refuse to forward the electoral votes for Virginia to Congress to approve. And the right to make a constitutional crisis. But I don't think. I mean, I won't be. I've looked through the literature. I mean, I think ultimately it's a very simple issue. The word naturalization existed in 1789. It was used in the Naturalization Act of 1790, passed by Congress. And a natural-born citizen is someone who doesn't have to be naturalized. Ted Cruz didn't have to be naturalized. He's therefore a natural-born citizen.
I agree.
Anybody else? Professor.
Professor Festa, yes.
Okay. So say there's an executive order that's arguably within the zone, only binding on federal employees. I'm thinking, for example, of the President Obama's order for federal employees to ban tax-law driving. Sort of a salutary policy, no congressional pushback that we know of. Maybe it's the Youngstown thing. No state pushback that we've really seen. Are there still, given the size and scope of the federal government as an entity, are there still rule of law concerns or separation of powers concerns with that sort of, that kind of an executive order that only binds the federal government? Purportedly.
It's sort of traditional and polite for professors when another professor asks a question, you stop and say, that's a great question, because you want to sort of, but that is actually a really good question. I'm not just saying that. And I think, I think it can be a rule of law violation if there's no legal authority to do it. I mean, the question is, I wasn't familiar with that particular executive order, but assuming the president cites some statute that says I have the authority to dictate driving rules somehow.
As the boss.
As the boss, right, as the boss. So there actually there's 2 separate issues. One is there a statute that allows it, and if not, is there some inherent executive authority? Because if you believe in the unitary executive, which I do, the unitary executive means that that the whole executive branch's power is really the president's power, and everyone who works for him is just an agent. There's no such thing as someone who works in the executive branch acting really independently. Ultimately, it's the president's power, and everyone else is just an agent. Then is there some inherent power that basically minor employment details that any boss could tell, like dress code, like you're not allowed to, do you need a statute to impose a federal dress code, or if people are starting to come in wearing,
That's why Josh wears a tie, right?
Otherwise, think of a student. It's true.
I got that till I was like 40, actually. So I think I think those are interesting issues. I think one thing that comes out of your question is that the president should be cognizant of these things, even if there won't be any pushback. Even saying 100% of the public supports, just to show one's fidelity to the rule of law, one should show that the president actually has legal authority to do what he's doing.
All right, I think there's one question in the back. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just curious about your view on the Iran bill and whether it should have been characterized as a treaty.
Good question. Good question.
That is a good question. And I'm not just saying it's stuck to the students now. The scope of the treaty power is pretty unclear, I guess is the right word. And it seems to me that under the common law of the Constitution, let's say, of what people traditionally did for most of America's history, something this big would have been considered a treaty matter, much like the Panama Canal Treaty. I mean, President Carter, when this whole Iran thing was going through, said, why didn't President Carter just sign an executive agreement with Panama to give back the Panama Canal? He would have had to get 2/3 of the Senate. This was Ronald Reagan's big issue in '76, where he challenged Ford. It would have killed off Ronald Reagan's political career. And the answer is that we just didn't think at those times that something this big could be anything but a treaty. On the other hand, since then, we've had massive executive agreements on all sorts of things. And it's become sort of regular for the president to sign all sorts of agreements that are not within the treaty provision, or at least are claimed not to be. So I'm not a scholar of the original meaning of the treaty clause of the Constitution, and I'm not really sure what it's supposed to be. But I would say that that for most of American history, it seems to me an agreement with an international foreign government on a major foreign policy issue that, more importantly, perhaps also led to the removal of sanctions. So it actually had legal consequences. Should have been up to a treaty power, because
But there was a statute attached to it as well of removal of sanctions. There was the Iran Treaty Authorization, the Authorization Act, the Corker Bill.
Right. So that question is whether the Corker Bill is itself constitutional, then,
Right.
because can Congress give away its own authority to change the law by having the president
majority
raise it
vote.
by majority vote? The short way of saying is I don't know. It seems to be better practice to do things by treaty, both because it's taking a more conservative, with a small c view of the president's power, a more limited view.
And President Trump can rip it up.
And that's the second thing. And then
This is your closer. What will President Trump do to whatever Obama
if
did?
it was a treaty, it would become the law and not so easily revoked. Now, all the Republican candidates, I think, have said, first, either the first thing or maybe the third thing we're going to do when we get to office is tear up this agreement. That's just not.
Cruz said it. Rubio said he wasn't so clear. But yeah.
Like the third thing. Right?
Yeah.
So it's bad to have major international agreements be subject to the whim of whoever happens to be in office at the time because they didn't have popular support.
Yeah, I think we're out of time. Yeah. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, David.
Our next event will actually be February 9th.